Today on The Friendly Futurist, we discuss the future of food. And welcome back to another episode of The Friendly Futurist. And you might remember back in Season 1, Episode 14, we chatted to James McWalter about lab-grown meat. And you also might remember the point I made that it's not just plant-based meat or lab-grown meat or even insects for food that's going to represent the future of the food. In fact, it's all that tied into a new agriculture ecosystem that will solve many of the problems for a hungrier and more wealthier population. Remember, even in developing countries, there are lots of people going into the middle classes, and once people reach middle class, what they want to eat more meat. But unfortunately, we're running out of space and land that can be cultivated for meat. Now, 14.5%, that is the percentage of greenhouse gases that are emitted by animals. And that could be high as 33% if you take into the fact that for land that's cleared to grow crops such as soy, that can contribute to the greenhouse gases. And that's quite a lot. Very soon, by 2040, we're going to have a population of 9.7 billion. Now, this is tipped to reach peak population before what many economists and scientists are saying the population will shrink afterwards. But at 9.7 billion people, we'll need resources of two planets to keep everyone fed, healthy, and hungry. So we really need to take the future of food seriously. Our guest today is Paul Shapiro from California. Now, Paul's the CEO and founder of the Better Meat Company. He's also a fellow podcast host covering this subject. Now, Paul's method is a little bit different from James's from Series 1. See, James is all about growing sort of like a vat full of cells in a hermetically sealed laboratory. That's lab-grown meat. Paul is different. He's growing meat via the Fungi Kingdom, feeding waste products and turning it into a juicier steak. Now, I might have to mention that Paul has been a vegan for over 30 years, and he's kind enough to join us in the studio today. Welcome back, and today we've got CEO and founder of the Better Meat Co., Paul Shapiro from California on the line. And Paul, welcome to the show.
Dave, thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Pleasure's all mine. Now, recently I've read an article over in Japan where some scientists have 3D printed some of the world's finest meat that's in Wagyu beef over in Osaka. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess, Dave, I'd point out this. The planet just isn't getting any bigger. Humanity's footprint on the planet is getting bigger, but the planet isn't getting any bigger. And one of the primary ways that we leave that footprint is through our food print, principally in the amount of meat that we eat. And so the problem is it just takes a lot of land, a lot of water, a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and more to raise animals for food. Yeah. So, people want to eat meat, obviously, but can we deliver that experience without having to raise and slaughter animals? And, go back to like the 19th century when the only way we had to get ice was out of frozen rivers and lakes, and people would, transport this ice in insulated boats all around the world. And that was a big part of the economy, was the ice trade, because people wanted it for their in-home ice boxes. Well, when you enter the advent of industrial refrigeration, and all of a sudden you have a new way to give people that experience of ice, but instead of coming from nature, it comes from human-made technology. And the ice barons of that era, and there were ice barons, they were livid over this technological innovation, and they railed against what they called so-called artificial ice. And they said it was unnatural, that you didn't want to give it to your kids. It was unsafe. But in the end, we all know it's the same experience that you get eating ice from, frozen by technology versus frozen by nature. And today you fast forward and we all have artificial ice makers in our homes. We call them freezers. We don't think there's anything unnatural about it at all. And I think the same is so with meat. For thousands of years, just like the only way we had to get ice was out of nature, well, the only way we've had to get meat is out of animals' bodies. But today we're inventing new technologies that allow us to get that meat experience, to satisfy our meat tooth, so to speak, without the need to raise and slaughter animals. So I'm enthusiastic about what the example that you're talking about, this 3D printed steak. But there's lots of technologies to do this. There's a lot of ways to peel this potato, so to speak. And so I am enthusiastic about 3D printing and a whole variety of other ways to mimic the meat experience without animals.
And that's a good point. And I think 5-10 years now, when this comes the norm, we wouldn't be none the wiser where the meat come from.
Yeah, I think that that's true. We're in a position where right now most people eat meat not because animals were slaughtered for it, but really in spite of that fact. Think about like, you walk into a room and you flick on a light switch, right? You like what you want is the experience of an illuminated room. You're not wondering, oh, is this coming from fossil fuels? Is it coming from renewables? Like you are just thinking, I want light in this room. Well, similarly, I think a lot of people, when they eat meat, they just want to satisfy their meat tooth. They're not really thinking about whether an animal was slaughtered or not for it. In fact, if they did think about it, they would probably think, I wish that an animal hadn't been slaughtered for this. Yeah. And so I think in the future, people will just be happy to eat meat, even if animals weren't slaughtered for it. In fact, probably preferably eating this type of new slaughter-free meat.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, today with your company, we're talking more about plant-based meat, because I know back in Series 1 we were chatting about lab-grown meat. So from your angle, what's the primary difference between, well, obviously it's grown by plants, but how do you come about growing plant-based meat?
Sure. Well, let's talk about how you do this. So, you just talked about cultivated meat, which is real meat grown from animal cells as opposed to animal slaughter, right? So that's one way of doing this. So, go back to the fossil fuel analogy, you want lots of alternatives, right? You want wind, you want solar, you want geothermal and more. Well, when it comes to the factory farming of animals, the problem is so severe, you want lots of alternatives. So it's not just cultivated meat. Yeah. You also want plant-based meat, you want hybridized meats, you want microbial protein, and so on. And so in the plant-based world, basically the way that most people do it is they grow a field of peas or a field of soybeans or a field of wheat. And then what they do is essentially harvest that. We'll just take peas as an example. You harvest the peas, and then you mill it into a flour. And your pea flour is not that high in protein, so you've got to fractionate it. So you remove the fiber, remove the fat, you concentrate that into a pea protein powder that like an athlete or bodybuilder would consume. Yeah. Now you have something that's high in protein like animal meat, but doesn't have the texture of animal meat. So you got to subject it to something that's called extrusion, which is basically a lot of heat, a lot of pressure. And you then change the molecular structure of the protein so that it becomes, instead of globular like a plant protein is, it becomes stringy like an animal protein. Wow. And that's how you get the basis of plant-based meat. So you basically grow the field of peas, do some processing to it to change them to make them more like animal meat than they are like peas. And that's the way you do it. However, what we at the Better Meat Co. are doing is different. So that process that I just described is, how you get great products like the Beyond Burger and so on. And I like those products. I eat them. I think they're very good. So I'm all for them. However, I think there is a better way to do it. And that's what we're doing at the Better Meat Co. We are not relying on the plants at all. Instead, we're relying on fungi. Fungi are an entirely different kingdom than plants are. And unlike plants, fungi actually naturally contain a meat-like texture. So fungi are far more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So if you look evolutionarily speaking, fungi are much closer to animals than to plants. And this is why mushrooms have a meatier texture than plants do. In fact, mushrooms have been used for centuries as a meat substitute in Asian cuisine. So what we're doing, though, is not using mushrooms. What we're doing is using microscopic fungi, and we subject them to a fermentation in which we feed them potatoes. And just in the same way that a cow eats this grass and converts that grass into steak, our little microscopic fungi eat potatoes, and in that process, they make a product that looks remarkably like animal meat. And that's really the magic of our fermentation. But unlike a cow who takes a year of feeding her before you slaughter her, with our fungi, we harvest them less than 1 day after putting them in the fermenter. Wow. So we inoculate our fermenter, feed the fungi potatoes, and within less than a day, we are harvesting a product that really looks and tastes like animal meat. So that's our method, is using fungi fermentation to create better meat. That's what we're called, the Better Meat Co. And we can create a meat experience without the need to raise and slaughter animals.
And also another good point I like to raise too, because you're using fungi rather than plants, that means you're not clearing out the forest or grasslands and stuff like that. So you're not having that detrimental effect on the environment, which I'm not going to say the other plant-based meat manufacturers are guilty of, but that's potentially there's a risk of for doing that if we want to have a feeder hungrier world. I think the stats show that we're going to grow to about 9 billion people by 2050. So I think that's a really good way of doing it.
Yeah. So, Dave, you're bringing up a good point, which is that, today there's about 7.8 billion of us walking around the planet. However, barring any catastrophe that's going to occur between now and 2050, we're expected to add a couple billion more humans to the planet. And as I said earlier, the planet just isn't getting any bigger. So how are we going to feed 2 billion more people with the same planet that we have? We're not going to be farming the moon. We're not going to be farming Mars. We have one celestial body to farm. And the problem is that raising animals for food is taking up a gigantic portion of that planet already. We're raising forests, either to provide grazing land for cattle or to grow crops to feed farm animals. So I agree with you, Dave, that plant agriculture does take up space. However, because animals are so inefficient at converting crops into meat, when you eat plants directly, you are using way less land than if you eat animals, because animals are eating so many calories of grain in order to produce a single calorie of meat that no matter what, if you're eating plants directly, you're going to be having a lower footprint on the planet. But yes, our fungi fermentation system does actually have a much lower footprint on the planet than even plant-based, which is better than animal agriculture already.
And also, probably because you're feeding potatoes, it also probably a potential for other food waste to get fed to the fungi.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Dave. In fact, you're even more right than you know. So what we do is we like to try to use as much agricultural byproduct as possible. So our little microscopic fungi can consume a wide variety of starchy foods. What they're really good at doing is converting starchy foods into high protein foods. And so what we can start with an agricultural byproduct that may only be 1% protein, and within less than a day, convert it into a food that has 45% protein. That's the magic of what we're doing.
Wow. That's really, really incredible stuff there, Paul. Now, another big hurdle I see with lab-grown meat and planet-grown meat, and it's particularly over in your part of the world where you have at least 7 states trying to enforce laws that if it's not coming from an animal, you can't call it meat.
Yeah.
What's your sort of strategies how to overcome this legislative roadblock?
Yeah, so, there are some states that are trying to pass laws on this topic now, and we've seen this with the dairy industry too. And it's not new. It's not new. You go back to the 19th century in America when margarine was invented, and the milk industry passed all types of laws to try to suppress this new competitor. They passed margarine taxes. They passed laws requiring that margarine be dyed pink to make it unattractive to consumers. And some states just started to ban margarine altogether. And so there is a rich history of industries, of incumbent industries, trying to enact legislation to suppress potential new competitors. And we're seeing that now in the meat industry. Some, not all, but some meat companies are lobbying for legislation that would require that the manufacturers of these animal-free meats have to have disparaging names on the package, like artificial or synthetic. And others, though, are taking a more forward-thinking approach. They're taking an approach in which they are actually pioneering their own plant-based meat lines. And I think of it kind of like what happened in the 1990s with digital film. If you go back and look at the film wars of the 90s, you had Kodak and Canon, and they were vying for supremacy in the camera space, in the photography space. And they both knew about digital film. But Kodak was concerned that it was going to cannibalize its core business of selling gelatins and print films and all the chemicals you need to make the print photos and so on. And Canon, however, embraced digital, saying, even if it cannibalizes us, we think it's the future. Well, we all know what happened, right? Kodak went bankrupt, and Canon is now the largest manufacturer of digital cameras on the planet. And there's a lot of meat companies that see that. And they recognize that Canon is still in the same business. They're still selling us a means of capturing our memories, right? That's what they're selling us. However, Kodak is no longer in that business because they couldn't adapt. And so the meat companies see this, and many of them think to themselves, well, if we can provide the same experience to our customers, so Canon is selling a way to capture our memories, so if we could provide the meat experience, but we didn't have to raise animals for it, why wouldn't we do it?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so they don't want to be the Kodak. The forward-thinking meat companies want to be the Canon. And so they are not only not pursuing these ill-conceived legislative suppression efforts at labeling, they also are introducing their own plant-based lines and investing in startups who are pursuing animal-free meats as well.
Great stuff, Paul. And I know that a lot of the bigger restaurants, burger chains over there, and also over here that have adopted your competitors like Beyond Meats, have adopted the Better Meat Co? Like, are you going to see some in, say, Burger King or McDonald's in the near future?
We would love to do that. It would require some time for us to scale up to be able to supply such a company. But we believe that our product that we call Rhiza, it's Rhiza, which is just Greek for root, because we're dealing with the roots of fungi here. But we are really passionate about working with those companies. They are so large that we would not immediately be able to supply them with the volumes that they would need. However, if they liked the product and they wanted to buy it, we would go build the factory to make it for them. So we want to work with the biggest food sellers to help them reduce their footprint on the planet and enable them to use fewer animals and to rely more on plants and fungi.
And what's the point, just for the average consumer out there? Have we reached price parity between, say, alternative meats and traditional meats, or are we just about to that point?
We are not there yet. So if you look at the plant-based meat that's on the market, it still is sold at multiples over the cost of conventional meat most of the time. And so there is a Moore's Law effect that seems to be happening where the prices really are coming down. And that's especially being seen in the cultivated meat space. So if you look, for example, at the startups that are growing meat from animal cells, and I wrote a book on this topic. It's called Clean Meat, How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner in the World. And when I wrote that book, the price of it came out in 2018. When I wrote Clean Meat in 2018, or when I published in 2018, the price of making a burger from this type of animal cell culture, you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars for that burger. And only a few years earlier, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
But now you're talking to do that same burger about only tens of dollars.
Yeah.
And so, look, tens of dollars per burger is still way more than it costs to make a conventional burger today. But you can see the price just precipitously falling in the last decade. And I am enthusiastic that it will continue to fall. And I believe that just in the way that we need a carbon tax, we should have a meat tax as well that would help to pay for some of the externalities that are being wrought by our raising and slaughtering of billions of animals for food.
Absolutely. And also like to ask about the cultural aspects. And this is for sake for those who are Jewish or Muslim. Is this got halal and kosher certification as well?
Yeah. So actually, there are companies, interestingly enough, that are doing cultivated meat that is being produced in a way that some rabbis say actually is kosher.
Wow.
I'm pretty excited about that. I mean, as a Jew myself, I don't keep kosher, but I don't eat meat or dairy. So I'm not mixing meat or dairy since I eat neither. But, I'll tell you, I'm excited about this because, there's not that many kosher people out there, but I want them to have the option. I mean, not that many, meaning globally speaking.
Yeah.
But, so there are a good number of people who eat halal in the world. And we ought to make sure that those certifications are in place on these products, but there's nothing inherent about the process that would render them unsuitable for such certifications by the various religions.
Yeah, very good point. Now, Paul, as this podcast is about the future, the year is 2031. How do you see the landscape in regards to buying meat in the supermarket?
I think it's going to be very different, Dave. So if you look at, like, in the past, we've really thought of protein as being synonymous with a hunk of flesh from a slaughtered animal's body, right? That's what people think of as protein. But I think by 2031, people are going to have a far more diverse view of protein. They're going to think about a whole portfolio of protein. In fact, it's going to be, yes, still animal protein from slaughtered animals, but it'll also be protein coming from plants, protein coming from animal cell culture, protein coming from microbial fermentation, hybridized proteins, and more. In fact, I like to think about these novel culinary experiences that people might end up having. So if you think about, as an example with cheese, think about the time between when humans had domesticated cows, so they were consuming milk, but prior to the invention of curdling milk to make it into cheese. Nobody had ever dreamt at that point of Gouda or Brie or cheddar or any other type of cheese.
Yeah.
And now this new category of food gets invented. And it's something that people were literally addicted to. They can't give it up. They eat it every single day, right? And nobody had ever dreamt of cheese until it was invented in the, relatively speaking, modern human history, only in the last few thousand years. And I think that something similar might happen with a cellular agriculture revolution where we can create new novel culinary experiences where humanity will eat foods that we have never even dreamt of, that will open up new culinary portals for us, that will enable us to have real pleasures that nobody's even thought of, let alone fantasized about.
Absolutely. And finally, Paul, to wrap things up, is there anything I didn't ask but should?
Well, the only thing I'd say, Dave, is I really appreciate you thinking about the future. Too many people don't think about it. I have written a book on it. Again, it's called Clean Meat, How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner in the World. I encourage you to check that out and would love to hear from you if you get a chance to read it. Additionally, please visit us at bettermeat.co. Again, that's bettermeat.co. And get in touch if you want to join us on this journey to create a more sustainable and humane food system. We're trying to change the world here. We're trying to render the earth different from space. When you look down on us from space, we want you to see more trees. A leading cause of deforestation is animal agriculture. Well, if we raise fewer animals, we will have more trees and the earth will look different from space. That's our goal. And if you want to help us reach that goal, please get in touch with us and let's work together.
Absolutely. And Paul, congrats on what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. I think you're doing an excellent job over there. And I wish there'd be more people like you that, put both the feet of the world and the planet at the center of their business and their brand. So my hat goes off to you, mate. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Dave. It was real fun to talk with you.
No worries. And a big thank you to Paul for reaching out. And I hope you learned another avenue about getting that juicy steak onto your plate. Then I have to mention that Paul has also been a vegan for 30 years. And this is quite inventive for someone who doesn't usually touch animals to come up with an alternative meat. Remember, as Paul said, the Fungi Kingdom is biologically closer related to animals than the plant kingdom. And also, as a point I made way back in Series 1, Episode 14, we're going to have a multitude of alternative food sources, from lab-grown meat to fungi to plant-based meat to insects. And the great thing about fungi and insects is that they reproduce quite quickly, it's very sustainable, and we can offshoot all the waste products into these farms to produce that juicy bit of steak or that nice bit of bacon that you might not otherwise be none the wiser. It'll come from an alternative source without harming the animal. Stay tuned next time on The Friendly Futurist as we are discussing textile waste. Now, on the subject of agriculture, cotton in particular is also a very resource-hungry crop. It takes up so much water that we, in a climate-changing world, we really need for humans and animals to survive. Now, I've chatted to a lot of upcyclers over the past month, and we're going to chat ways that we're wasting so much cotton and other materials thanks to obsession with fast fashion. In fact, I'm championing return to slow fashion and the mindset of buying quality over quantity or price. Now, you've been listening to The Friendly Futurist. It's a podcast-based production. My name's Dave Monk, and remember, friends, the future is user-friendly.
Another podcast